Okay, one of the most famous startup shows of all these Live Aids before Live Aid came. And this is the first big Live Aid show at JFK Stadium. We were lucky in our group of people. We managed to get a couple of hundred tickets for this show because it was hard to get tickets for this show. And Glenn and me and a bunch of other friends went down there to see the show. I was actually lucky because I knew the staging company at Live Aid. So when I was down there Friday, I was able to sneak into the stadium and then go meet the staging company and get a pass. So when I got the pass, I decided, well, it's Friday night, the show's tomorrow, I'll hang around and see what goes on. And so all of a sudden, half the bands from the Live Aid show showed up to do their practice. In fact, I was on the stage seeing the setup, and there's a guy in a wheelchair, and they asked me to go push this guy in the wheelchair, and it's Freddie Prendergast, who just got back recovering from his accident, and it was his first time singing. And as he's practicing singing, behind me is Mick Jagger and Tina Turner getting ready to practice their show. So I actually saw 80% of the Live Aid show Friday night in short versions of how it would go, and then the next day we would be there, and then Glenn showed up. He was seeing the Pretenders that time.
Well, yeah, what happened was, because they pulled this together on somewhat short notice from
Right.
the gentleman from Boomtown Rats, Bob Geldof.
Yeah.
It was a big fundraiser for food famine in Africa. And so these bands, everyone was flying in, Tina
Yeah.
Turner and the Stones and Duran Duran, the biggest bands of the time, right, were all there. Phil Collins came, but many of the bands weren't touring. So the night we were in the Philadelphia, there was also Wembley. So it was they'd go back and forward, and then gradually Wembley ends, and it was all Philly after that. And some of the bands played in both cities, came across in the Concorde, but the bands who weren't touring the night of. So we arrive in Philly. We fly in on the Friday. This is the Saturday, is it? Yeah, Saturday. Yeah. So we fly in the Friday morning, and we hear on the radio, they go to this club and see this top Tina Turner's playing tonight, because they all wanted to practice. So rather than do a practice, many of them actually played clubs. So we saw Simple Minds and the Pretenders playing a small club called the Chestnut Cabaret the night before. I wish I went with Wolf to watch all the sound checks and stuff, which I didn't. But it was so amazing, that whole city. And then I remember getting there about noon the next day, and all I could hear was Bryan Adams playing, because he was he was a lesser light on that bill, but they wanted to have a Canadian on the bill, and he was playing. That's when we arrived. But then you fortunately got me backstage.
Yeah, and we both went backstage, and everybody was there. Hollywood was galore.
Madonna played with the Thompson Twins. Like, she became the biggest act in the world, but at that time, Madonna wasn't the biggest act in the world. But it was unbelievable, and this ticket's $500-600 all day long.
Now, one of the interesting things about this Live Aid show, Phil Collins played in Wembley Stadium, and then he got on the Concorde, flew in, and actually played at JFK. So he was actually the only real band that had two full sets.
No, I think Duran Duran came with them.
They
played at both
Duran
places.
played there too.
Yeah.
But that was unusual for two bands to play.
A lot
at
of
both
the big
venues.
acts were in Philly, but one of the big ones that took off was U2 at Wembley, when Bono came out and hugged that girl and was singing New Year's Day or something. But it was a great show, and as a result, it's so collectible. The ticket's not that beautiful, but it's more the show and how historical it was.
And the start of the Live Aid and Amnesty and all these other charity shows. This is the start of the police picnic, which started out in Oakville at a Ukrainian children's camp. And we were lucky we were able to rent it. Actually, the year before, I actually did Deep Purple there with some other friends. And then after Deep Purple, I went back to the Ukrainians and said, can I rent it for next year? And they said yes, and I told them I'm doing the police picnic. They actually thought it was a police picnic, but they didn't know that the band was the police. But this show was big. We had about 25,000 people out there. Much music came, and all the other bands that were brought there at the police picnic show, the Go-Go's were really good. So it was a great outdoor festival, Iggy Pop. In fact, Nash the Slash, we had to unplug him because he kept playing encores to encores, and we were falling behind schedule, and we knew the town would freak out if we played past midnight. But Nash the Slash wouldn't go off till we pulled the plug, and that was it. He was pissed off forever of us unplugging him, but we had 3 other bands to go before the police, so we had to move them along. Years after that, the police picnic moved to Exhibition Stadium, which was a lot harder to make it work because of the union bills at Exhibition Stadium. So they only had 2 more shows, and they just kind of broke even. So that ended the police picnic show. And the reason this one ended in Oakville was the mayor called up the church and said, "You shouldn't be doing rock and roll. You're a church. Rock and roll is not good." And so the church freaked out, and they wouldn't let me do a second police picnic there.
And
Politics.
There's never been a big concert. We're in Oakville right now in this studio, but there's never been a big concert in Oakville since then. That was the last big show 41 years ago. There's been a lot of kids grow up since then who've never had a big show in their backyard. But this show was amazing, but it went so late into the night. That was the other thing. The stage faced it into the town of Oakville, and the sound just carried. And I don't think it ended till almost 2 in the morning. It went really late.
Not quite that late, but
it
around
was late.
midnight, 12:30, because we got shit from the town. But right beside is 16-Mile Creek, and a lot of the friends told us they just sat out in their parking in their houses listening to the police music go down the valley, and it just went almost right down to Lakeshore because just the way it just echoed and carried through.
It was a great show, but I still have friends. I have a lot of Ukrainian friends in Toronto who want the poster because you pulled one on the priest. Because the priest thought it was the police coming, the chief of police and all his other guys have a picnic with their families. And so this is a great joke. It's in many Ukraine, because we have posters left and tickets, but they love showing this. If you're, somebody who attends the Ukrainian church and you point to this poster on the wall, it's legendary in the Ukrainian community, and that's now the Ukrainian cemetery. Because the kids' camp, it was getting too close to the city. They didn't want it as a camp anymore. They bought another piece of land, did the camp way out of the city, but we got the camp. I remember it had a pool, Stings and swimming in the pool or whatever, and we had all the bunks for the various roadies and stuff. It was a very cool event. But the other thing is, you had a lot of these tickets left over, and this was your show. So you've kind of killed the market. Like, this should be worth a lot more, but because you probably had 500 tickets left or something, it's not worth what it should be. It's probably a $30, $40 ticket. It should be a $100 ticket.
So this is the Beach Boys and Elton John and the Eagles and Joe Walsh playing. And the famous thing is this is at Empire Stadium at Wembley, which was their favorite big stadium in London. And this was the Captain Fantastic tour. This was when Elton John was going with all these other colors and hats and costume designs, and it was his big Captain Fantastic album out, which was huge. Now, at the stadium show, he invited the Eagles to play with Joe Walsh. Now, right after that show in London, they announced that Joe Walsh is officially joining the Eagles. So that was the show that made Joe Walsh become an official member of the Eagles band on that end. And of course, the Beach Boys, they were always big in England, but it was Elton John's Captain Fantastic show that made it big. And I actually have a show poster of that, and that's the type of tickets there, Wembley Stadium. I don't know what that ticket is worth because it doesn't really have the band names on it.
No, well, people would know by the date. It's I haven't seen that ticket before, but it's probably worth a couple $100 just being such an iconic Elton John. And then you still have the Eagles Walsh thing. Like, it's the first time they both be mentioned, because after that it would only be the Eagles. You would mention Joe Walsh.
I do have the poster in the program for that one and the ticket. I just haven't brought it to you yet. Now, down here in Knebworth, that's their Woodstock site. This Silver Cliff Music Award ticket was one of the biggest shows of Woodstock history, okay? Because there was 100,000 people there, but all the big bands from England were there because it was a charity to raise money for healing kids with music. So you name the band, Led Zeppelin, Paul McCartney, Pink Floyd, Genesis, they were all there, all the major bands, and we'll later show the posters of the bands that played there. But this was the biggest rock show that ever happened. I consider it bigger than the Live Aid show because they were all allowed to play up for about 45 minutes, and then McCartney was allowed an hour and a half, and Pink Floyd 2 hours. And Pink Floyd closed the show, not McCartney, because Pink Floyd was bigger for outdoor festivals and quad, and McCartney admitted that, so he let them there. But other bands like Cliff Richard, he was the Elvis of England, and he played there. So it was interesting to see Cliff Richards because hardly toured and never came over to hardly North America. So to see Cliff Richard play there, their Elvis songs was a really special one for me because all the other bands I'd seen many other times. And of course, Pink Floyd stole the show at the end with the quad. Okay, so this, folks, is the US Festival sponsored by kind of Apple Computer, but Wozniak was the guy that financed it. He actually put up about $32 million, paid a ton of money for all these bands. The tickets are worth something, but the show posters and the lineup was fantastic. And this was a separate show a week later, but this was the main weekend show. And the interesting stories about this show is, as you see, Van Halen was the big star on Sunday night. So Van Halen, he did a contract because he said, I want to be the biggest paid act for the US Festival. And so they gave him $1 million to play. And that was the start of $1 million pays. So Van Halen said, okay, I'll play for $1 million. And then the same trouble we had with Canada Jam looking for acts. They were blocking other acts so they couldn't get any. And so he wanted another big act. And David Bowie was doing his Moonlight tour only in Europe. So Steve Jobs says, well, if he's only playing in Europe, if I can get a big 747 plane and load up all of Bowie's gear and equipment, I'll fly him over to play the only show in North America that summer. So to do that, not only did he have to pay Bowie in a big freight plane to call all his stuff up, he had to pay him another $500,000. So he paid Bowie $1.5 million. So when Van Halen heard, said, hey, I'm supposed to be in my contract the biggest paid act. So he forced Apple Computer, or Wozniak, to give Van Halen an extra $500,000. So Van Halen took that extra $500,000 and threw one of the biggest parties backstage. Big circus tent, jacuzzis, bars, tiki bars, and had a big party with a lot of fans and a lot of girls because he had that extra $500,000 to throw as a party, you know. So that's what made that show pretty good. And Bowie, the interesting thing about Bowie was after the Sunday show, because Monday was a holiday, around 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm seeing all these trucks come in with tons of gear, like 6 or 7 transport trucks are going like, who's coming in at 2:30 in the morning? And it was Bowie because his plane landed late and they had to get all the gear. And the main shows like Van Halen and Bowie, they would get the prime lighting shows. So you would have to set up their lighting grid, their backstage props and stuff before anyone else because it would take you 2 hours to an hour and a half to do it before the show started. So Sunday night at 2 in the morning, all the Bowie crews came in there and then turn around the corner and there's Bowie going, okay, I'm here from Europe, and they're, you know, off kilter from time zones. But they started setting up all the props and his big glass bubble tour and spider tour. And so I sat there and watched the dress rehearsal from 2:30 to 3 in the morning, and then they kind of got it set right. And then Bowie headed to the hotel to crash to show up. But it was a unique experience seeing all that equipment in there. And when you got money to fly all that gear in, it probably cost them $200,000 just to load up the plane, fly it to LA, and then right away fly him back to finish his European tour.
It's interesting. The ticket you have is from the Country Day, which is the least collectible.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, country's somewhat collectible, but it's not collectible like rock and roll. And if you look at this, of course, we talked about Heatwave being the new wave, start a new wave. This is much after. This is 83, but they have their new wave day with the Clash and Stray Cats, English Beat. Then they have Heavy Rock Day. Yeah. And then the Killer Day is May 30th, which is the classic rock and roll. And look at U2, Below Missing Persons. Yeah. Like U2's not that highly regarded then, but now they would be up here that much above Bowie or something, right? But
and I actually have the other tickets for the other show, which they might show up
blue
on the next pictures.
One of the other days.
Let's see if we have them on there. So these are the US Festival tickets that were printed, and they had this special metal 3D sticker on them, so you couldn't
almost like
photocopy
the early days of a hologram. Yeah.
Right. And this was day 1, and day 2 was 20, and then you could get a 3-day ticket.
New wave music this day, which is quite collectible because there was a lot of bands that became more famous later.
Right.
And then we have the other ticket, right? From
So if we go to the next one, it just says day 2 and 3. You could get a 3-day ticket or just go for the day at the US Festival. Now, when I worked this show, I learned about LA's air, which was really, really weird because outside of San Bernardino, which is just outside of L.A., every morning you would see the city smog come in. And after a couple of days, my lungs started hurting. And the roadie said, "Don't worry about it. You'll get used to it. It's just L.A. smog coming in. It makes you choke and cough for a bit." And I'm going, "Holy shit. I'm not used to this." But after a couple of days, you got used to the L.A. pollution. But it was really weird. In the morning, everything's bright and clear. And then when all the auto cars come, you could see this gray fog of pollution move into the area.
So that's Heavy Metal Day.
Yeah, this is Heavy Metal Day. Triumph played there. Van Halen played there. And the interesting thing about this US Festival is they had 350,000 people show up at this show. And they built a special park with hills, and it was called one of the first electronic shows. So what they meant for there is beside the stage area on the right side, they had all the latest on Apple computer, internet, and other stuff that was just coming out. So they did a big science tech show there. And I think that's how Apple wrote off the show, because they had all the best technology. And great guest speakers come to talk about it. So in the morning and the afternoon, you went to the big circus tents to see the latest technology or the latest healing stuff there too, and then go to the show. But
those tickets are all worth a couple hundred each, even in that condition, because it's such a famous festival.
Okay, so this is the Woodstock ticket. It's actually a real Woodstock ticket, and Glenn was lucky to find these tickets. They were printed, but when Woodstock became a free show because too many people showed up, they couldn't control the ticket sales, so these tickets were just held to the side. And then I guess a few years later you found them?
Yeah, now, lucky at the time, but now there's lots around. So what happened was, Woodstock was a 3-day festival, Friday, Saturday, Sunday.
Right.
There's 3 one-day tickets, or there's a 3-day ticket.
Right.
How they were ever going to get 500,000 people to leave after each day, these guys didn't really think this out very well in terms of Woodstock. But regardless, I mean, it became iconic because of the movie and everything else.
Right.
And just, it's the most famous concert in the history of rock and roll. And, but they had, I don't even know how many, but I bet you they had 100,000 tickets left over, and nobody threw them out, these guys that ran it. They still sell them today. And so this is a ticket that probably, had none of that happened, and these tickets had actually been used, this would be $3,000-$4,000 probably for this ticket.
Right.
Instead, if you look really hard, you might find them for $60-$70 at retail. They sell for $100.
Right.
Sunday goes a little more because it's Hendrix and stuff. So maybe Friday is maybe $100 at retail, Saturdays maybe $120, and then maybe $150 for Sunday, and then a 3-day maybe worth $200. Right. But they're all on this watermark paper that you can see here, so that was their control mechanism to make sure there wasn't duplicates being made. But they have boxes and boxes of tickets left over. So if you go on eBay today, you'll probably see 1,000 of these tickets listed right now. So it's a very competitive market, but it's funny if you're somewhere around where people don't shop eBay and they come into a show and they see one of these tickets, people could pay you $300-$400 just like that, but they're around. They're not that scarce. They're very iconic, but they're not scarce.
So this is the next day ticket.
Yeah, the Saturday. And I think The Who maybe was on the Saturday. I forget. There's different bands each day, obviously, but again, it's the same situation. Yeah. There's a lot of tickets. But then, how were those Friday people? I mean, you were in the concert business. Yeah. How are you going to get 200,000 people out of a park on a Friday night?
And come for Hey, Glenn.
Wolf, how you doing, buddy?
Good. I brought you a whole bunch of more rock and roll stuff to show you. And as I told you before, when you have over 10,000 rock and roll items, this is the place, Glory Day Collectibles, that you bring your stuff to find out what it's worth, whether it's passes, tickets, T-shirts, programs, posters, and other rock and roll memorabilia. Glenn's group, they analyze it. They tell you whether it's a real autograph, a fake autograph, a good poster, a good program, or whether they're copies.
If I'll get lucky, I'll find a joint in this pocket. No, nothing. Too bad. It's always good. You never know when you find drugs from one of the roadies.